great.
Yeah.
So, Nick, just could you introduce yourself a little bit for us?
Sure. So my name is Nick Schroeck, and I direct clinical programs, and I'm an associate professor of law at the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law. And my background expertise is in environmental law and policy. So I've done a lot of work over the years on water issues, water rights, water safety, water security, etc.
So, our project is primarily about water security in Detroit, especially. Could you tell us a little bit about what you mean by water security, or the flip side, the insecurity of water?
Right. Well, really an interesting question about what water security means, because for most people it's not something that you think about every day. And by I mean most people that aren't also suffering from issues related to poverty and issues related to thinking about where your next meal is coming from, how you're able to pay the rent, how you're able to pay your utilities. Water bills for a lot of folks in the city of Detroit for many years were considered something that you could ignore and you could perhaps let slide while you were focusing on all the other things that were very important, like making sure that your lights were still on and that you had heat in your home, that type of thing. Just in the last 4 or 5 years, through the city's bankruptcy, the city started to focus more on collecting money from people that were in arrears, that had debt related to their water bill, and that's when we started to see this big spike in shutoffs. Previous to, again, the last few years, the city would sort of let people float along, and even if they had large arrearages, there wasn't this mass movement to shut off people's water. So within the city of Detroit anyway, when I think about water security, I think about water shutoffs, I think about the city really ensuring that people are either current with their bills or on a payment plan, or they're just cutting off their water. So that's, the first thing that pops into mind. But there's a lot of other. I would also think about water security in terms of access to clean water. So not just water affordability, but making sure that people have access to water that's safe for them to drink. Of course, that's illustrated recently by the Flint water crisis and the lead in the water crisis, but so many other issues related to access to clean, affordable drinking water. And so, yeah, I think for many of us, it's not an issue that was really at the top of mind until very recently, because, again, unless you're someone that's struggling with poverty and that's struggling with the ability to make your basic ends meet, which is, again, a lot of people within the city of Detroit. But if you're not one of those people, I think it's often water access and water affordability isn't necessarily at the top of mind. It's just, this bill I have to pay every few months. But for many people, it's critically important, because they're making a choice between going without something else important to make sure that they have water for drinking and sanitation, etc.
Yeah. Could I ask you to, this is a big question, could I ask you to tell us, in your own words, what the water shutoffs really are about, and how they basically evolved over time?
Yeah, so when we talk about water shutoffs in the city of Detroit, this was really a movement when the city was entering into municipal bankruptcy. There was this attempt to look at all of the potential assets the city had, and also all of the debt or liabilities the city had. And there was this thinking that the Detroit Water and Sewage District at the time, which was still a city governmental department, that there was a lot of money to be had there, either through privatizing that service, that utility, or through spinning off certain parts of it, that there was assets there that you could monetize. But there was a concern that with looking at monetizing some of those assets and thinking about perhaps regionalizing the drinking water and wastewater system, which now we have the Great Lakes Water Authority, which has been regionalized through the bankruptcy process. But when they were looking at the water department, they realized that there were many customers that had pretty large arrearages or debt on their accounts, and so there was an attempt to collect on some of that, because the city was trying to show where it had assets and where there were assets that they needed to collect. They wanted to show their creditors, and then also, probably more importantly, the surrounding counties, so Oakland County, Macomb County, that were going to be potentially joining this new Great Lakes Water Authority. They were really pressuring the city of Detroit to get people to, come current, to basically make up the debt that they had on their water bills. So that's when we started to see this really intense focus on either, and part of the problem was just a horrible lack of communication from the city's perspective, where people didn't know that they were serious this time. that if you're not on a payment plan or you're not paying your debt, that we're going to shut off your water. And they started just doing mass shut-offs. I mean, there were tens of thousands of people over that. I think the first year that were actually had their water shut off, and then they started rolling out some of these payment plans and that type of thing. But by then there were already, again, thousands of people that had already experienced water shutoffs in their home. And so previous to that time, previous to the city's bankruptcy, the city would often just kind of let people float along, even if they had a fairly significant debt on their water bill, without shutting them off. And so it was a real change in practice, if not the policy. I mean, the letter of the policy would always say they can shut off your water if you're in debt, but they just wouldn't do it. Well, now all of a sudden, because they're getting some pressure from suburban counties that are potentially entering into this new water authority to collect, on a more regular basis and try and bring more money into the system, that's when you started to see this real shift. It became even more controversial because they decided to focus on residential properties rather than business properties. So, it came out that Ford Field, where the Detroit Lions play, they had this massive debt on their water bill, and they were negotiating with the city to try and reduce that debt. But they were cutting off the water for Sunday, football games, right? Whereas they were, going to many different individual homes in the city and shutting off the water. So that really, that led to, there was a lot of negative publicity and press that the city received for this process. I should say lack of process, for just deciding almost overnight that, like, hey, this is the way we used to do things. Now we're shifting it. And the problem is with that shift, that went from people, having a reliable, safe supply of water in their home to being without almost overnight. So from that point forward, the city has made attempts. There's now a fund where people can apply to be part of a payment program to try and, get your bill up to date if you have debt. But it still is a real challenge for many people because our water rates are actually high as well. Like we pay, relative to people's income in the city of Detroit, if you look at our demographics with our income, what our household income is versus what people are paying for water, it's not as high and disproportionate as in Flint, but they are paying, a decent percentage of their income is going towards paying their water and sewer bill. And so, that becomes a real pressure point for a lot of people to try and decide, do I pay this bill and have water, or do I not pay it and pay for, food or gas or something else?
Right. So, what stands out for me in this entire process is that how the scale has really continued throughout. You had about 17,000 households shut off 2014, and that's pretty much continued every year. 15,000, 16,000, 17,000, that's continuing.
Right.
So why is it continuing, I guess would be a common question that a lot of people would ask. Is it because the rates are just too high? Is it because people are just not paying? Why is it continuing in that scale?
And this is just a guess, a hypothesis, because I don't know the answer directly, but I would say there's a lot of people that are really struggling with poverty. And so when you have a city that still, even though the unemployment, I'm not sure what it is today, the rates are down a little bit, but we're still very high levels of unemployment, very high levels of people that are on some sort of government assistance. And so we already know that our social safety net for people that are kind of struggling on the margins, they don't have enough to get by. And so with very large numbers of people in poverty, large numbers of seniors that are on Social Security, et cetera, if you don't change that underlying equation, in other words, making sure that people have enough money to get by, and as long as we're expecting them to pay for water service delivered to their home, I think you'll continue to have that tension, and to have relatively high numbers of people that are facing that threat of shut off. There's still, I think, a lack of information out there for people to understand about the payment plans that are available. I also think we could do more to help people understand ways that can conserve water to save themselves some money, ways to. But again, this gets to if you're in a home that you're renting, that you don't have control over the fixtures in that home, like the toilets and faucets and things. And if there's a leaky pipe or something, you may not know about that as a tenant, but then if you're responsible for that water bill, I mean, that can lead to a lot of problems. And we've run into many of those issues too, where you have landlords that are not on the up and up with their tenants, and either they're expecting the tenants to pay the water bill, or they're saying they'll pay it, but then they don't, and then the people that live in the home end up having the water shut off. I mean, that type of thing still does occur with far too much frequency.
Right.
So yeah, I think it's really just, we have a population that really does struggle to make ends meet, large parts of our city, and so as long as that's the case, something has to give. And if the city's going through and they're looking, on a month by month basis and seeing that people are behind on their bills, and they say, all right, well, the remedy is to just shut off the water. I think you're going to continue to see that happening unless you're providing some other type of assistance or relief for people to be able to keep up with their bills.
Is there data available on the shutoffs and the impact of the shutoffs, and how accessible is this data?
The data is not very accessible. I mean, we're not seeing Great Lakes Water Authority or the City of Detroit just freely putting out press releases saying, hey, we shut off 18,000 homes last year. They're not talking about what are the underlying issues leading to that shut off. It's just really about the bottom line. Are you behind on your bill? Are you in debt? If so, we can shut off your water. Very hard to get information. Most of the stuff that gets out into the public sphere is, I think, through Freedom of Information Act requests that are done by the media or nonprofits that are directly seeking this information. But then your question about the impact of water shut off. There's been some research. I know Henry Ford Hospital, in partnership with Wayne State, did some research looking at spikes in things like waterborne diseases in areas where there's been high numbers of water shutoffs, and pretty disturbing stuff. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but there was a measurable difference in illnesses that can be attributable to poor sanitation through lack of availability of clean water in neighborhoods in Detroit where there's been high levels of shutoff. So that right there, I mean, if there's any measurable amount of human health negative outcomes from water shutoffs, I mean, I think that should be enough to give us pause. But then finding that information, that was through a hospital system that has a lot of Detroit residents as members or customers, and then academic research. I mean, this isn't something that's coming out of the municipality or out of the water system. They're really just trying to collect the rates, and they're being aggressive about that. And again, part of this is, I think you had a culture change within the city from where it was sort of this blasé, okay, we'll pay when you can, type of thing, to like, hey, you're behind, we can and we will shut off your water. I still don't know that message has gotten all the way through. But I really think the underlying issue is just that people don't have enough money to get by, and so they have to make choices. And sadly, the water shutoff is something that's continued to be a problem, and I don't think we know enough about what that means to people that have their water shut off. I mean, there's some things like we know people have lost their children because, right, if you don't have water in your home, Child Protective Services can take your kids away from you. So we know that's happened. We know that people have lost property as a result of this too, meaning that they're no longer in their home. So those are very, very negative outcomes as a result of this kind of aggressive water shutoff policy.
So you mentioned the Henry Ford Health System study. Do you know what the status of that study is?
They released some initial findings about a year and a half or 2 years ago, and that's what I was aware of. They had a little conference here at Wayne State, but I could get you the guy's name that was running that study. But yeah, they were basically just looking at, they have a high number of people within their healthcare system that live in the city of Detroit, many seniors too, so they can actually track, based on what they're going in to see the doctor about, and then also just overlaying that with demographic data, they can get some really interesting insights.
The reason I ask is because I've actually heard unconfirmed stories from among community organizers that study and that data was actually killed off because of political pressure.
Interesting.
So and we haven't seen anything more on that front. So So I was wondering if you had any
and I
on
like
that.
when I when I talked about where they saw this measurable spike in
Yeah.
waterborne illness. I mean, that was preliminary information. It wasn't a final report. So yeah, good good question. I don't know. Maybe for whatever reason, maybe it wasn't finished off. But I don't have any. Sorry, I don't have any insight into whether there was pressure
Right.
to kill it off or anything like that. Also, I mean, there's been accusations from some folks in the like NGO advocacy community that there are targeted attempts by the city to go after certain neighborhoods that they want to clear people out of for redevelopment or some other type of investment. When you look at the maps, there certainly are these clusters of high numbers of shutoffs, and I'm sensitive to the fact that there could be some nefarious intent on the part of the city, but looking at it from my perspective, I think it's more that you've got neighborhoods where there's just higher instances of poverty, people that are really struggling to get by, and that's why you're seeing more shutoffs in those areas. But that's another thing that there's been that allegation made, and sitting here, I can't say definitively that's not the city isn't targeting these neighborhoods for extra enforcement or something. I don't know that, but there's a lot of these types of theories floating out there as to why are they focusing on this neighborhood, or why are they focusing in these types of people, whatever the case may be. There's a lot of, I think, rumors and theories and that type of thing.
But it does seem that the underlying effect, though, is a lack of trust.
Absolutely,
in institutions that should matter, that should have our abiding trust and faith.
Right.
And that's the worrying part.
Well, there is a lack of trust in our government, and I think people in Detroit are very sensitive to the experience that folks experienced in Flint, and I think our government, our State Department of Environmental Quality, lying to people about the safety of their water. I mean, that really has resonated, and people have realized that that's a challenge, and so I think there is a mistrust. I mean, setting aside all of the historical issues that you've got within the city of Detroit and questions of trust with the suburbs, and now you get this regional Great Lakes Water Authority. I mean, the history of racism and segregation that we have here, and I think all of that stuff seeps into when you start looking at something like the water department, and that was considered a city asset. This was a crown jewel, which was, many people talked about the water department as a crown jewel within the city of Detroit, and the fact that now has been regionalized to a great extent. I mean, I think that rubs a lot of people the wrong way, and they kind of question what was the motivation behind that. And I think all of that feeds into this sort of mistrust and questioning of motives on the part of the city and the state government. Primarily the state government, but there was a lot. I mean, going back to the bankruptcy and emergency management, there was a lot of mistrust and just questioning of the motives. Like, this seems like it's all about money. Like, what about our people, and what about people that have stuck it out in the city through thick and thin? Now you're telling them that they're going to lose their property because of a relatively minor debt on their water bill. I mean, it just you can see how that leads to some mistrust from people.
Sure. Tell us about what you've been doing with the Environmental Law Clinic, because I know you've been working. You also worked with Wayne State's Law Clinic before that. So tell us a little bit about your work trajectory.
Sure. So going back, I ran directed an environmental law clinic at Wayne State University Law School for about 8 years, and during that time we worked a lot on water-related issues, water quality, water quantity, also water scarcity and water security type of issues. Just to give one example, we were approached by a neighborhood development corporation, a nonprofit community development corporation in the north end of Detroit several years ago, and they wanted to know what was the process for someone to actually challenge a debt on their water bill. So, first of all, to question whether or not it was accurate, and second, to actually go through a process of appealing that debt and that assessment. And there was a policy. So this is, I assign my clinic, say, see what you can find, go through the city of Detroit and Detroit Water and Sewage Districts, see what you can find. And we found there actually was this appeal process for challenging a debt on your water bill. but it was so convoluted. I mean, I'm reading this thing. Here I am, an attorney. I'm supposed to be a professor to teach my students. I'm reading this thing, and I'm like, I can't make heads or tails of what this appellate process is supposed to be. How do you expect a resident who is got a million other things on their mind? How do you expect them to ever figure out this appeals process? So we tried to then break it down into plain language so that they could share with members of their community group how you would actually appeal a debt on your water bill that you thought was improper or assessed wrongly. So, I mean, that's just one example. So those are the kinds of things. But then we would also work on legislation. So, we would either unsolicited, we would get contacted by state representatives or state senators that were trying to work on water affordability issues or water scarcity issues. And so we would work on legislation. So I'd have students that would do some research, look at like, okay, what are the current laws in Michigan? Are there opportunities for some change? If so, what would this new legislation look like? We'd even draft some language occasionally. And then we would also, potentially look at assisting people with finding legal representation if it looked like there was a case that would be good for litigation. So it's not always that we would take it in the clinic and litigate cases, although we did do some litigation, but we would oftentimes try and link up people that have really good facts from a litigation perspective with attorneys that could then represent them. So that a lot of that was historical. Did some research on rates and rate structures to see, is there a way in Michigan with some current unfavorable precedent that we have from some state Supreme Court decisions, is there a way to still provide water to people at a lower cost than the sort of market rate? So we did some research on that several years ago as well, which we can talk about. But currently, so now I direct an environmental law clinic where we work in partnership with the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center. And so my students support a lot of the work at the center, and some of that has included work on lead in the water and trying to limit lead exposure in children in the city of Detroit and in southeast Michigan, both through the water and also through lead-based paint in homes. And then we work on a whole bunch of different issues related to energy, and air pollution is a big thing, obviously, in Detroit. So we work a lot on what I refer to as our environmental justice work, which is largely related to air pollution and air quality within the city. And then I would say the final thing is we do a lot of work on just sort of like Great Lakes water issues. So bigger picture stuff like climate change impacts related to the Great Lakes, invasive species, that type of thing. But so it's from the really we get into the minutia with people on trying to help out individuals in certain instances. But as far as representing clients, we represent groups, so organizations, environmental organizations, community organizations, that type of thing. So we're typically not. If you came to me and said, "I've got a really good case, my neighbor's polluting my property," I would refer you to another attorney who could take that case for you. So we do a lot of that type of interviewing, counseling, and referring clients out, or saying, you know what, this is something that we could actually help you with as a nonprofit. We can help you manage this particular issue. So through that, there's a lot of water related work that we do in the clinic.
So, what are your students? What's the general reaction of your students when they first encounter or learn about some of the issues related to water in the city? What have you seen so far?
Well, so most of my students are really surprised when they hear about water security issues and they hear about lack of access to affordable clean water in the city of Detroit, because for many of them that they just don't come from that background. These are people that they've graduated high school, they've been through college, now they're in law school, and so most of them have come from a more financially secure background than many of the people in Detroit that are experiencing some of these issues. So part of it is we have to talk a lot about why it is the way it is. Why are people struggling to pay their water bills, right? Is it because they're choosing to? I mean, are they buying big screen TVs and going to the casino every night? Like a lot of those myths that are out there. It's like no, we need to really talk about cycles of poverty, we need to talk about just why these things are the way they are, and water security is a big part of that. And so, yeah, I mean, at first, for most of the students, again, I've had some that I think are more from that background that understand it just innately because they've lived through it. But by and large, most students that are in law school haven't had that type of lived experience, so they need to learn about it. And so we, through case studies, talking about past clients that we've worked with, we bring in a lot of guest speakers to kind of tell the stories that are important for my students to learn, so that they have. And most of my students end up being lawyers working in law firms, and when they're doing environmental law work, they're typically defending industry, or they're working on behalf of the state or municipal governments. And so what I hope is that they have some understanding and some empathy of what the experience is for many people, just trying to get by, live their lives, and provide a safe and healthy home for their children. And oftentimes in the city of Detroit, that is very difficult to do, and it's difficult to do that in a way that you can also afford to pay your water bill. So there's a lot of just kind of like education of why things are the way they are in the city of Detroit, and how we can hopefully address that going forward. And then for many of my students too, that their initial response is just like, well, why don't you just pay the bill? Like, why don't you just pay for it, right? Like, and so it's just, again, you have to. What $200 or $300 may not sound like end of the world for a lot of people, but you start unpack those numbers, and that's a huge portion of a lot of people's income that they can actually would have to put towards that water bill. And so again, for students that maybe come from more affluent background, they need to understand that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I love to be a fly on the wall during some of those negotiations.
Yeah, and it's also, I think. There are people within the water department and within city government that don't understand that, right? Which is really shocking, right? Like, just being like, well, people just need to, get their stuff together and, pay these bills. Like, well, it's not that simple. So it's a law clinic, and so we're focusing on the Safe Drinking Water Act, and we're focusing on the regulations that make sure that we have clean drinking water to provide to people, and we talk a little bit about infrastructure and all that, but we're really focusing on the laws, but the way that the laws either protect people and help people, or that somehow they can also be a hindrance to people realizing their full potential, right? And that's where things like debt, and how crippling that can be, and having your water shut off, what a just horrible experience that can be in your life, and how disruptive it can be, and it can just completely get people off going down a path where it's really hard for them to recover and to get back to where they want to be. So all that kind of holistic stuff we have to try and approach to the clinic, because you can't just plop law student into a situation where they really have no concept with what people are going through. And even one more wrinkle I'll throw in there is that we call them dual degree students. They're primarily Canadian students we have a partnership with the University of Windsor Law School, where in 3 years of study they can then sit for a bar exam either in Windsor or in Detroit. And most of them are Canadian students from certainly upper middle class to upper class backgrounds in Canada. And for them, I mean, like, Toronto poverty is like different than Detroit poverty, and like I hadn't really thought about this, but it is. And so that's been really fascinating to kind of see some of their those students, some of their reactions and responses. We have a housing law clinic that we work in partnership with United Community Housing Coalition, and just the reaction of some of these Canadian students are just like,
whoa. Yeah,
right. And like this is the way things are. Like they just their social support network for housing is quite a bit different than ours, to say the least. So anyway, there's a lot of that just kind of education in more of a holistic sense, and not just about the laws and how the laws impact our work, but what are people's actual lived experiences, and how we can try and assist them.
So, moving from talking about experiences of your students to experiences of your clients,
right,
and especially perhaps the most vulnerable clients, how easy or difficult is it to get on a RAP,
right,
or a water assistance plan?
So, getting on a water assistance plan can oftentimes be very difficult for people, and so part of it is that, like, you have to have the ability to pay something, and so for some folks that's just hard, like being able to scrape together enough money to even get on the plan to begin with, and then staying on those plans. I think that seems to be, and I haven't looked at these numbers in a while, but I remember a couple of years ago, you get people to sign up for these assistance plans, but then there would be a drop off pretty quick, and so I think that's a challenge too, helping people understand, budgeting and how they can hopefully, make enough space within their budget to be able to stay on these payment plans. That can be a challenge, and I still think there's just a general lack of awareness. It's hard to get to everybody to, really what needs to happen, I think, is to have a one-on-one conversation where the water department's sending people out to talk to folks and, like, kind of explain to them the process. I mean, it's not enough to just say, okay, every now and then we're having these community meetings where you can show up, or we're putting a flyer or a letter in your mailbox. I mean, like, a lot of those things just don't get through where they need to be. I mean, and people, you talked about skepticism, people being the level of mistrust that they have from government, and there's people that, some of our clients, that they just ignore letters that come from the government or whatever, which is not always a good thing to do from your legal perspective. But there's people who are just like, I can't deal with this right now. I've got too much else going on in my life, and they just kind of put that in the pile. And so I guess lots of times people don't even know that the assistance programs are available to them, and then once they know that they're available to them, there's not always the follow through to help people stay current with staying on the assistance program. So that's a real challenge. I mean, and it's often like a throwaway line where you'll hear the mayor or city council or somebody like, well, we have this assistance program with millions of dollars available to help people out. Well, okay, but how are we actually ensuring that money is actually helping people so that they don't have to go through this whole shut off process once again? And one thing that I'm not sure about is if the assistance money can be used to pay, like, a reconnection fee. I think people have to pay that out of pocket. So I don't know. There's still barriers, even if you're helping with debt and that arrearage. There's still barriers to, like, getting that water turned back on. People still have to come up with some money, and that's difficult.
Can you tell us a little bit about some of the people who have come to you for assistance, and what some of their problems have been, and how you have tried to help them?
Yeah, so in our clinic, we typically are dealing with clients that are organizational clients, meaning that they're part of an environmental group or a community organization. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is almost what I would call, like, more public education rather than representing individuals. So if we have someone come in or call me up and they say, I have this particular issue with my water bill, or I'm struggling with making payments on this water bill, that's typically something we might be able to refer them to Great Lakes Environmental Law Center, to one of their attorneys, or maybe to Michigan Welfare Rights Organization, groups that could really help those people individually with the challenge they're facing on that day, because we're just really not set up for that. We're much more able to assist with if they want to have a community meeting, and we can explain how billing works. We can explain how the appeal process works if you've been assessed a arrearage and a penalty, or we can explain how you can be eligible for some of these payment plans. I mean, that's more the type of stuff that we're set up to do through our clinic. And then also trying to look at changing some of our laws at the state level, perhaps the national level, to try and assist people that would actually help them on an individual basis, but we're going to try and change a law that would be more broad in its scope to help all the citizens in the state of Michigan potentially. So yeah, we're more in the I'd say public education, and then also policy change and law change arenas where we function more so than that kind of one-on-one assistance. That's something that we're not as set up to be able to do.
Right. Okay.